because it's not a part of your makeup. And so what I tell people is, if you're going to step into your Dharma, it is going to require you specifically to say all of the things that you specifically are afraid to say. And it's going to require you to do the things that you are specifically afraid to do. You know, because like there are children being burned by bombs right now in parts of the world that everyone listening don't even know the names of. But that's not what's haunting you. What's haunting you specifically, like the person listening, is so unique to you that if you were to recognize it, you would understand clearly those are your adventures.
Welcome to the Creativity and Consciousness Podcast, a space to explore the intersection of creativity, spirituality, and personal transformation. I'm your host, Jake Cobran, visionary artist, author, and your humble guide to the exploration of our consciousness. In each episode, we dive into ideas related to magic, visionary art, and alternative spirituality. I bring you conversations with leading thinkers and innovators to help us tap into our creative potential, expand our minds, and transform our lives. Whether you're an artist seeking inspiration, a spiritual seeker exploring new paths, or someone on a journey of self-discovery, this podcast is here to help unlock new possibilities and awaken our inner power. Let's journey beyond the ordinary. Welcome to the Creativity and Consciousness Podcast. Thanks everybody for being here, virtually, wherever you are out in the world. I'm really excited to have the great Erick Godsey here on the podcast today. It's a real honor to speak to him. I've really gained so much from his work. It's so valuable. Really recommend diving deep into it, into all of his podcasts and his writings and courses. They've provided major upgrades for my life, and I've really learned a lot from them and gained a lot from them. So happy to have you here, Erick.
Yeah, man, it's really good to be here. I just want to apologize to your audience. I'm going to be whispering today. I've lost my voice and I haven't found it, and it's been about 90 days, but I can whisper. And I'm really grateful that my work has helped you specifically, because when I started to write and share what was on my mind, my dream was to help artists. And everyone, quote unquote, is an artist, but at the same fucking time, not everybody can paint. Not everybody can actually design architecture and etc. You're fucking talented, and so it makes me feel like I'm not insane that people with competence resonate with what I do. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I'm actually curious to ask you a little bit about your voice and how that process has been for you. I actually did I did a vocal training a few weeks ago with somebody who's like an opera trained singer. And I kind of asked her about sort of what you've been going through, and she suggested that it's kind of like a neurological thing, more so than like a physical thing. Is that what you've discovered as well?
So, I'm a writer by craft, and I'm dramatic by astrological sign. My moon is Leo, and apparently people tell me that means that I'm dramatic, and so I have a lot of theories about what I think is going on. I've had a stutter my entire life, but since this voice thing has happened, when I am forced to whisper, I don't stutter at all. So that's interesting. Two, I had so like my kind of default is skeptic, scientific materialist who has done enough drugs to know that that's not the whole story, but that's still my default. last year, I had a very powerful, witchy friend. And when I say powerful, what I mean is when she starts to sing, weird shit happens in the environment that my scientific, materialistic mind has a hard time cataloging. She was doing a sound healing on me, and she was using what she tells me is a throat chakra bowl. That is like, it was a bowl that was designed to attune to the frequency that is correlated with the throat chakra. I actually really don't know what that means, but I take her word for it. As she was playing this bowl, it cracked when she was trying to heal. And this was 1.5 years ago. Like, this is far before my throat shit started. And she freaked out because she was like, in my entire career as doing this, I've never had a bowl break from me playing it. And so, she felt like this was a super important thing. And I was just talking to her last week, and she brought that up, and I got full body goosebumps. When this started was I had actually gotten into Kundalini, techniques, and I was doing breath of fire every day. And after about 8 days, I noticed that my voice started to feel strained. And so I stopped doing the Kundalini, the breath of fire. I've tried a bunch of things over the last 90 days, but when I was talking to this friend last week, she just kind of casually said, what if a clearing process was being started and you stopped doing the thing that was creating the clearing? And as she was saying that, I felt goosebumps and I felt my eyes water. And so, I don't know, but I'm recommitting to getting back to the Kundalini practice. But yeah, I've tried a bunch of stuff, and it is particularly humbling to know that it is neurological. And the truth is, I really can feel that this is designed by my unconscious for my ego, and I trust it. And I'm still fucking frustrated, because the number one thing that people have reflected back to me my entire adult life is my voice is like the thing that stands out to them. So, I'm being humbled, and without opening too big of a rabbit hole, there is a model of individuation that is mapped out by Bill Plotkin, specifically in his book, The Journey into Soul Initiation. And long story short, he believes that there's one true dark night of the soul, and all the other ones before are basically like practice runs. And that the legitimate one tends to happen in mid-30s to 40s, and it takes years. And that to do it, the ego has to get lost. And I remember when I read his book 2 years ago, I was like, yeah, I for sure have already gone through my version of that. But then as I was reading, he takes 6 pages to reflect to the reader, hey, you probably think you've already gone through this. But by the very fact that you're reading this book, it's almost a guarantee that you haven't. And I remember when I read that, I was like, by the time I got to the end of the book, I was like, maybe I haven't gone through that yet. And it scared the shit out of me. And honestly, I feel like I'm in the thing that I thought that I'd already gone through. But I hadn't. Because it's been almost 100 days.
Wow. Yeah, I'm curious if you were I feel like you have an amazing book inside of you, or something that hasn't quite been born yet, and I wonder if part of that is calling you towards something that requires speaking less or focusing on more written material or something like that.
You have just looked straight into my heart, because basically the big insight of this process is I have began and abandoned 3 books so far in my life that I have on my Google Drive somewhere. What I realized about a month and a half ago is, oh my God, this is my wound that will birth my first book. And I've started. And so, I think you're spot on, my dick. I think you're spot on.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I can't wait to read it. That's so cool. And, yeah, it's interesting how things that seem really terrible in the moment can actually end up being the biggest gifts to our lives in the long run, you know? And it doesn't make those crises like suck any less, but sometimes it's hard to zoom out to those bigger timelines to be able to really see how an event is impacting who we're meant to become and how we'll grow from those experiences.
Yeah, like I have had a stutter my entire life, and for my entire life it's almost like when I speak there's like a Guitar Hero conveyor belt of next words in the sentence, and I can see the words that I'm the most likely to stutter on, and I try to imagine different words that I can replace that word with so I don't stutter. And I've been doing that my entire life. And what I can see now is what people reflect as like me being intelligent or good with words is because I've had that burden my entire life. And then once I started to record podcasts and I had to edit my own podcast and I had to listen to my own stuttering voice, I realized that if I slowed my cadence down by like 20%, the percentages of stutters went down dramatically. And so I got this slow, articulate speech pattern that then for the next 6 years has been like the number one thing people have reflected back to me as like what they enjoy. And so because that's like, whenever someone complimented my voice, all I could see was the 20 years of pain, you know? And so I have like a deep trust that the wounds that come into our lives are like the alchemical preconditions for a new gift, that I really haven't despaired much in this process with my voice. I do remember when I had an empty tell me that it was spasmodic dysphoria, and then I googled it and it said lifelong condition with no cure. For a couple of hours I felt despair, but other than that it's been like a deep trust because of my history.
Do you know about this idea of Chiron from astrology?
Vaguely.
Okay, so like Chiron is the wounded healer. So it's the place that we're fundamentally wounded. It's usually the place that we struggle with the most in our development. And it tends to be where people excel later on in life. It kind of, because it's such a struggle, it pushes people to develop greater awareness around that,
for sure,
that place of life. You know, and they actually need to invest time and energy into kind of mastering it. Whereas if somebody's just automatically competent in that area of life, they may not. So it's like, it's interesting for me, like my Chiron is in my 5th house, which has to do with like art and self-expression, you know? So it's like as a teenager or whatever, I was really shy about my expression. I had a lot of self-consciousness about it. But it's like I've overcome that, and now I can help other people overcome that. And Chiron is the wounded healer because it's the place that we learn to overcome our struggles to then help other people overcome those same struggles, you know?
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's one of the most I find that it is like the most heretical thing to try to convince someone else of about their pain. But it's the most transformative thing to adopt personally about your pain. Because I find that whenever in my life I have tried to, when I was younger, I was much less adept at this, but trying to help other people recognize that about their pain when they're not ready is what I have found is that it was cruel of me. But then when I see people adopt it for themselves and I see how much it transforms their life, it just really raises this reverence for that is one of the key codes of the game of life. But you cannot force it on other people, which can be so frustrating, especially when you're watching loved ones and family. But man, when people adopt it voluntarily, it does transform their personality.
Yeah, it can be really painful when you try to impose that perspective on somebody who's not ready to hear it. And I guess it's like I've heard this term post-traumatic growth thrown around.
Mm-hmm.
That some people just have an orientation towards challenging or traumatic experiences where there's some kind of belief that it's going to make them stronger, and just that power of belief seems to catapult people to upwardly spiral from it. Whereas other people will spiral downward and get stuck in cycles of victimization and helplessness and fear and pain instead.
And what's so interesting is the psychological research on this shows that there's two major storytelling styles, because we're all telling ourselves a story based off of what we experience our entire life. And Carol Dweck's work has found that there's two broad storytelling styles. And the first one she calls it's funny that I'm blanking on the technical names, but the gist of it is the first one, it's fixed. That I am insert qualities. I must behave in such a way to reinforce these qualities. So the key one is, if you were told you were smart as a kid, or if you were told that you were talented, that actually tends to create a fixed mindset where now your identity, because you've been praised for whatever, you now have to protect it. And whenever you don't know how to do something or you fail, that disqualifies what you think makes you worthy of love. But then there's the growth mindset people. And these tend to be people who were complimented on their effort, how hard they tried. These people, compared to the smart people, the people who were told that they were smart, when both groups are given hard or impossible to complete tasks, the growth mindset people, the people who were complimented by their effort, they're able to work on the problem more than twice as long. If it is a solvable problem, they score much higher than the ones who were told they were smart their whole life. And there's so much fascinating shit around those two things, but I think that's one of the core factors in how we respond to pain. I grew up, wow, Eric, you're so smart, for 20 years. And then I started doing psychedelics, and I just fucking destroyed that identity. And then I learned to identify with, I am the one who does not give up. I'm the one that does his work every day. I'm the one who will never see his goals become true. But I'm going to write 1,000 words today, was in high school, man, I was such an insufferable asshole because I was terrified and I was trying to protect my identity as a smart kid. And, man, it was so much wasted energy trying to protect that false identity.
Yeah, I can resonate with that because I'm still the arrogant asshole sometimes, who thinks I'm really smart to the detriment of, or to the annoyance of people around me. But yeah, I try to adopt that growth mindset as well. I read that book; it was quite good, and it's helped me a lot with learning new things. Like when I started doing podcasts, even my goal was just to do, I think my goal was to do like 50 podcasts or something like that. And I set that number goal because that was something I could actually measure and work with.
For sure.
Rather than like, I'm going to do the best podcast ever. Yeah. And actually one of the things that really inspired me was seeing like the very earliest Joe Rogan podcasts. I don't know if you've ever watched like the ones where he was just starting, but like they're not great, And it's like, okay, wow. So this is before he put in his 2,000 reps or whatever. And it makes a huge difference. But I did sort of the same thing when I started tattooing, but it's just the idea of like doing as many of the things as possible. Because that's something I can actually measure. That's like a goal I can achieve. I have no control really of the quality of it. Like I'll always do my best, but I can't guarantee that it's going to be the best ever thing that I do. You know,
for sure. The perceived quality.
I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
You want to talk about cathedrals?
Let's fucking go.
Cool. Yeah, I was telling you before we started recording this that I had a tarot reading today, and the card that came through for me was the Three of Pentacles. And the Three of Pentacles has a photo of people constructing a cathedral, and then the tarot reader asked me, what's the cathedral? What's your cathedral? And I was like, this is crazy because I'm going to be talking to Erick Godsey tonight, and I wanted to talk to him about this. So you have this idea about building cathedrals. You want to explain it a little bit?
Yeah, so my entire life, or at least most of my life, I identified as an atheist, but I still prayed, which is kind of psychotic. But and I've always been enamored, specifically with cathedrals. Like out of everything that I see in movies and TV shows, there's always been something about cathedrals that has always like grabbed something in me. And then I believe it was 2.5 years ago, I started like my first formal mentorship. Like I've never had a mentor who was alive. Like I've worked with Aubrey for a while, but he's always felt like a big brother, and he's not really like a teacher. He's like, keep up if you can, motherfucker. Like it's not like a, hey, let me help you. But I started working with this man named John Churchill. Have you heard of him?
No.
I think he has 3 PhDs in psychology, Buddhism, and also Chinese medicine. And what he would do is he would listen to me ramble, and then he would recommend one book. And that was basically our hour together. And I started to go read the books that he offered. And the first book he offered was called Building the Cathedral by the author's name is not his real name, and so I always forget it, but it's a really small book. And I started reading that book, and I was like, this is exactly what my soul, like, I felt it just amplifying my soul's whisper to an intoxicating level, and I entered into, a kind of tamed mania where I wrote 7 articles in the course of 7 weeks right before going into my first darkness retreat. I then which I'll tell on this podcast because it fits into this question. And then a year later, I re-release those articles as podcast episodes. And I have them drop each day that I'm in the darkness for the second time. And I have more insights about this in the darkness. And then by the time that I came out and I sold my first class, which was a 15-year homecoming as an artist who's trying not to be a broke motherfucker, that it all kind of crystallized. So, for people who want the 10-hour long answer, check out my podcast series called the Horizon series. But if I were to condense it, I've always loved the Joseph Campbell quote, if you want to see what a society worships, look at its horizons. Specifically, its cities' horizons. And our horizons in our major cities in the U.S. reflect our malignancy, that we worship cancerous energies. And I just started thinking about, like, what kind of people would it require to build a cathedral? Because the average cathedral took 300 years to construct. And like, it really, like, kind of broke my brain, because I realized, like, I don't know almost anyone who has the temporal horizon of multiple lifetimes when it comes to trying to create something. And I know almost no one. Like, it's like all of the people our age who are really audacious tend to lack almost any competence. At least that's what I find in my circles. Like, the most audacious motherfuckers can't even fucking make a website, and they just can't make anything. And then the people who can make things kind of get hypnotized by consumerism to go work at some soulless job where they are able to, get their paycheck because they can actually make things happen. And so I started dreaming, and I do a lot of intense experiences to kind of like continuously humble my arrogant ego. And about 2 years ago, before I started this writing project, I was doing like an ecstatic dance, and then we did some type of like group sex magic thing where we imagined like what our future selves want from us. And I got a really weird, like lightning strike insight that I'm supposed to build a regenerative city. And I was so confused by that, because nothing in my life before had ever intimated towards anything like that. And I was like, I don't even know where the fuck to start with this. Like, what? And so I wrote these essays, and then I went into my first darkness retreat 2 years ago. And what my mentor Churchill told me, because he had done darkness retreats before, and he's steeped in Buddhism, and that's where the technique is kind of like most famously known from. He said, as a Westerner, your only job is to actually learn how to stop. And then on the very last day, once you're as relaxed as you can possibly be, ask your Buddha body whatever questions you have, but don't try to figure anything out until that last day. So I listened to his advice. I could go into detail about the darkness retreat if that's interesting, but when I got to the last day, I asked myself, like, what does my soul want from me in this lifetime? And the spontaneous thought that came through that I hadn't thought about since that first ecstatic dance sex magic thing was build the regenerative city. And the moment I said it out loud, a was such a profound synchronicity that I instantly started laughing and crying. Like, oh my God. And then, fast forward a year later, I had created my first, class. Because when I was in college, I wanted to be a philosophy professor. And, a bunch of things happened, mostly doing too much DMT. But I didn't continue that path. But I reclaimed that dream and I created the mentally fit class for Fit for Service. But that was my, retrieving of a previous dream and then remixing it with my new style. And then I went back into the darkness, and the big insight in the darkness was I had to reconcile my resistance to what I think of as manipulation. So, my entire adult life, I've been particularly gifted at being able to read people, and that comes from having a dysfunctional childhood. If you're a sensitive child and you have an emotionally dysregulated parent, you will tend to develop the capacity to read people deeply as a way to avoid pain and to even potentially manipulate the emotions of your parent who is unstable, to be happy. And when I started smoking weed for the first time in my 20s, I started to get this almost superhero X-ray vision into people. And it scared me because it felt like I was stealing from people. Because, I could see when people were lying. I could see when people were trying to manipulate. And I kind of pushed it down because it felt like stealing. But this most recent time in the darkness, as I really am starting to feel fatherhood come into my life, I was able to alchemize my relationship to trying to make things happen. Because my entire life, all my blessings in my 20s basically came from me being like a sacred fool. I just say yes to shit that scares me. And I don't know what's going to happen, and it just continues to work out well. But I realized that I needed to grow up. And so, the alchemy that I had, and this might seem goofy, but it really changed things for me, was what does someone do if they throw a surprise birthday party for someone they love? They're actually trying, they're manipulating, they're orchestrating. That was the word that came through. That if you love someone and you want to create a special experience for them, you have to weave and try to make things happen. And a terrible birthday party thrower is someone who plans something for the birthday person. And then if it doesn't go the way they want it to, they start to be a pouty bitch at the other person's birthday. And that's not the way. The way is to set an intention, try to make it happen, but then once the situation starts, you listen to what is emerging, and then you riff with it. And so there was a lot of dreams and other things that made this a very potent insight, but by the time that I left the darkness retreat, I realized I am comfortable and I trust myself to wield power. And so I basically started trying to make shit happen. And long story short, for me, the Cathedral project I'm working on is I want to help give birth to a new type of education system that can teach the future doctors that will live and work inside of the future hospital that I have had visions of. And everything I'm doing right now is step one of a 20-step process that I'm going to dedicate my life to, because there are a lot of rabbit holes here, but poisoned. And I really think, like, the dude who created the lobotomy won a Nobel Prize in his lifetime. And I really think 100 years from now, we're going to look back at the DSM and antidepressants, specifically anti-anxiety meds. And we're going to look at it like something worse than the lobotomy. And I've gotten a lot of hate for talking about this stuff. But the truth is, I know I'm more researched on this than almost everyone who's ever critiqued me. And I want to see a revolution in my lifetime when it comes to mental health. At some point in my life, I want to write kind of a heretical reimagination of the DSM, where I reinterpret every condition in that book as different ways the daemon acts up when we're out of alignment with our Dharma. Because I actually think that like 98% of the classifications of the DSM are that. I do think that there are sufficient environmental poisons in our culture that fuck up our hardware, but that the vast majority of what's in the DSM are the different types of wounds we can incur when we don't know how to listen to our daemon, and therefore we're out of alignment with our Dharma. And so, I'm trying to toe the line of being a artist who is also a heretic, but who is also secretly a competent clinician.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think that this idea of the daemon, it aligns really well with the philosophy of Thelema, which asserts that we all have a true will to live out in our lives. And I remember reading Mastery by Robert Greene, and he was talking about Beethoven, who was just a tortured soul. But when Beethoven was making music, when he was channeling that sort of what would probably be classified as PTSD these days, but he was able to channel all of that pain, that unresolved trauma through his music in a way that was healing for him, as well as healing for people that would hear the music, And so, yeah, there is something actually healing about taking action in the world and like making something.
For sure.
And aligning yourself with a deeper purpose. It just sort of sorts things out in a certain sense.
Yeah, like art is this. Like, one of the things that a commitment to art creates is it creates competence. And I think competence is inherently healing to the psyche. Inherently, for its own sake, but at the same time, it produces flow states. And flow states are of these states of consciousness science has figured out how to measure, which is not all of them, but of the states we have figured out how to measure, flow state is the most satisfactory and also physiologically replenishing state of consciousness other than deep sleep. And so, like, what I have found personally, because we shared before the podcast started, I have a part of me that is a master cynic, that knows, that has read. Anyone here? Okay. If you want to create a monster inside of you, study analytical philosophy, study evolutionary biology, and study behavioral economics. If you bring those three things together, you can create a monster that makes Russell Cole from the first season of True Detective look like a bitch. And I think Russell Cole is one of the greatest characters I've ever seen in a story in our lifetime. And so I have that part in me. And he's trying to kill me. And my only response enough and I've gotten enough responses from hundreds of people that what I write about has helped save their life. It's because I'm constantly trying to save my life. And it's really funny. I was talking about this on Michael Phillips' podcast a while ago, and I got an email from someone who was basically trying to tell me that what I just said isn't true about myself, that I don't need to make art to be seen. And I was just like, I can't believe you had the audacity to send me this email. You don't know me. Trust me. Trust me, motherfucker, yes. So, but I love it, And yeah, so and at the same time, it's like the essence of Jungian psychology. Like, it's really interesting what has happened. Jung has gotten so popular now. But before Jordan Peterson blew up, almost no one I knew anything about Jung. But if you actually read Carl Jung, the essence of his philosophy, of his psychology is, if he can get his patient to start making art like they're redeeming the soul of the world, it heals them, period. Like, that is the essence of his psychology, is start making art, and not like start making art like it's your responsibility to redeem the soul of the world within yourself. And so, as an arrogant motherfucker, that really resonates with me.
I would challenge that somewhat, only in the sense of just having been in artistic communities primarily for the last, 15 years, like the amount of mental illness that exists in artistic communities, and like substance abuse, and just there are really balanced artists out there, but artists also have a tendency towards not being balanced. And
it's a good point.
There's something about that. I mean, it's like, for me, when I'm in sort of tragic states, that can sometimes be really inspiring, because the art, it's like, yeah, I don't know what I would do without it. Like, there are times where making art is just the most healing thing I can possibly do, But
yeah, the nuance with Jung is that, like, if you deconstruct his life, what he did first was he established himself in the quote-unquote realm of the Father, which is competence for the community that generates value. Like, that's like the prerequisite. So he was a fucking doctor, and he was a very competent doctor. He actually created what we now call the word association test. And, he was doing his doctor thing for years. And then he started having visions. And then he started listening to the voices in his head and painting. But what he did is he kept that to himself. And he used his competence in the realm of the Father as a doctor and a psychologist to, over the course of 50 years, distill little chunks of his visionary art and translate it into his realm of competence, which was science and psychology. And so he had this tandem thing happening where he would take in downloads from the, from the mysterium tremendum. But then every day he would spend 8 hours being competent and titrating. And what I think, why most artists who are mentally ill are, is because they're only taking in the transcendence. But they haven't, chopped wood, carried water, found their little realm in the realm of the Father. That becomes their, workshop to titrate, Blake's visions of the heavens. Like, for Blake, he had poetry. And he was a really good painter. But he had his workshop. And so it feels like most artists, most people who identify as artists, they need to find their workshop and their competent translator. And then all the people who have competence out in the world, they need to wake up their fucking artist. Because we all have it, you know?
Yeah, there's something about responsibility in a certain sense, I think. Also, it's like having even like assistants that work for you, or having children or these kinds of things can often
For sure.
snap artists into a deeper sense of alignment, where they have to embrace a higher level of competency that puts their kind of mental illness like back in balance. And then another thing too, it's like what you were saying about all. I was just saying, like, with what you were saying about how the DSM being definitions of different ways that the daimon acts up. Like, just because somebody is an artist, even if they're a professional artist, doesn't mean that they're truly expressing themselves, or like truly
For sure.
allowing for that to totally come through. Like, I know a lot of artists who make very beautiful art, but I know that they actually have this like dark, like fucked up part of them, and it's like, when are you going to let that out through your art? It's like, that's you. Like, it's part of you. It's like, you can't censor any part of you. You have to give all the different parts of you full expression through the art that you create, and it's only by doing that it kind of, I don't know, mythologizes your inner world to the point that it lets you come into balance or individuation or something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the terrifying insights about how our perceptual systems operate is that everything that you are afraid of is unique to you. Because there are so many things to be terrified of that you don't even perceive, because it's not a part of your makeup. And so what I tell people is, if you're going to step into your Dharma, it is going to require you specifically to say all of the things that you specifically are afraid to say. And it's going to require you to do the things that you are specifically afraid to do. Because like, there are children being burned by bombs right now in parts of the world that everyone listening don't even know the names of. But that's not what's haunting you. What's haunting you specifically, like the person listening, is so unique to you that if you were to recognize it, you would understand clearly. Those are your adventures. Those are your caves. And so whatever it is that you're not saying and that you're not doing, those are for you. And one of the things I love about teaching is that you get live feedback from other nervous systems about what ideas of yours actually resonates the most. And one of the ideas that I have found through teaching that really fucking strikes people is this idea of death cookies. And so a death cookie is an idea that was developed by a psychologist named Phil Stutz. He has a documentary on Netflix called Stutz that's very good. What he calls death cookies are anything that our soul knows that we are meant to do, but we are currently not facing, is a death cookie. And a death cookie is almost like, if you think of a game, it's like a quest icon that is hovering around you, and that what produces it is the soul. But every moment that the ego turns away from it, we lose some life force that goes into the death cookie. And there's like a self-respect and a self-love that kind of starts to come out of us and is absorbed into that death cookie. As soon as you do the thing, as soon as you quote-unquote eat the death cookie, you get back all of that life force plus a little extra that you didn't have before because you did something that you were afraid to do. And that each time we eat a death cookie, we grow our soul force. And I like to think of it like we are the harbinger of a soul. And our soul is like a seed. And each of our death cookies are like little icons of like food for that seed. The fucked up quest of the ego is to actually eat enough soul cookies for the seed of our soul to erupt and to blossom. But what that means is it's going to destroy your ego. You know, and so like a big part of my teaching is to try to Trojan horse people into eating their death cookies. Because you get to a point where the like gravitational pull of your soul grows to the point where there's a foreground background reversal, where instead of your life being ego oriented, it becomes soul oriented, and your soul becomes the center of your psyche, and then your ego basically becomes like the really effective emissary to your soul. And most mental illness, that's actually too broad of a term, most depression and anxiety is when the ego is trying to be the center of the psyche. I think manic depression is when there's a tug of war between the soul and the ego, and it hasn't found its center. And you know, I posted that post the other day about mania. I really think, especially for artistically inclined people, learning how to reframe what we call manic depressive and recognizing that it is the task of our life to learn how to tame that mania to then be crystallized into actual competence that is the task of an artist who's going to keep their fuck alive, you know? Because maybe the worst thing is an artist who has tasted the audacity but has basically given up on it to, be, it's like Lancelot who leaves Camelot to just be a fucking dude in the forest. It's like, dog, you're meant to hold that spear.
It's like Luke Skywalker going off to that island in the new Star Wars movies or whatever.
For sure.
But
fuck, Luke?
what was that? But yeah, man. So I really resonated with that post because I feel like, I guess of all kind of like DSM classifications, like the kind of manic depressive cycle is something I would resonate with the most as like an artist, is definitely getting sometimes just riding these like fucking highs where I feel like I can create anything and just like the visions are flowing and I feel like almost like I have God power. And then once all of that energy is depleted, it's like there's nothing left. It's like the reserve tank's completely empty, and then I just am like super depressed and like laid out. And sometimes like the depressive phase will last for like months sometimes. But I'm curious, like what have you found in your own practice to kind of like temper that or to balance that? Because I think that's something that a lot of creatives can resonate with.
Yeah. So, it's been 15 years in the making, and I didn't have space to talk about some of my embarrassing stories on the post, but like, I remember in college I thought that I had written a philosophical proof of God. And then I woke up the next day and I read my half page of writing. And like, I think it was the first time I realized like there's something wrong with my brain. Like, something's really off. And, like, one of the first times I did mushrooms, I didn't have the language for it back then, but I was with my partner at the time, and I was like swaying in my room with her, and I was channeling the apocalypse. Like that's how bad it was when I was younger. And and I have many more stories, but fast forward to now. When I have a wave of mania come, like, my discovery of the shimmer was mania. Like, I was possessed for like 3 weeks, and I was having insane dreams and synchronicities that would make a younger man, have a psychotic break. But I'm kind of seasoned at this type of thing. Yeah, so one of the things I do is I make sure to eat really well and to continue working out. Like, I know that if I'm starting to, because when I catch a wave of mania, my sleep is fucked. I tend to stay up super late, and then wake up early, and I'm just fucking on fire. But I will eat well, I'll work out, and I don't do extra drugs. And so, like, I will not do anything that's an upper. Like, I'll ride the wave of marijuana, but I keep it low doses. And I really know what my tolerance is. And frankly, sometimes I'll microdose mushrooms, but I know to stay away from LSD. No, like MDMA or Adderall, or I don't do cocaine, but none of those. Now, to be fair,
No modafinil.
right. But to be fair, I think it's high magic to learn how to ride the waves of each of those. And I definitely have played with all of them. And, but I think specifically for people who struggle with manic depressive and haven't really found how to run it, good recommendation, don't fuck with stimulants while it's happening. The next big thing is, because I have that part in me that was like a trained, are you familiar with behavioral economics as like a field of study?
Not really.
So it's basically hundreds and hundreds of studies of the built-in human delusions that we call intuition. So our intuitions are perfectly calibrated if the environment is like the environment that we had 1,000 years ago. So like our intuitions with people and things like that are super good, unless that person is a magician or a trick, or is some type of like unless that person is trying to trick you and that they understand the human psyche. And behavioral economics is basically like, if you want to believe in conspiracies and the deep state, it's almost like behavioral economics is them telling you straight up, here's how you hack a human. And there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies. So, because I am intimately aware of how we delude ourselves when I'm in a state of mania, I'm not trying to predict the future. I don't think that Joe Rogan is giving me secret messages through his podcast to go show up at his doorstep, like, I have all these filters about, like, what I said in the post is, if you understand how to keep your psychic content mythic crash back down and you look around your life, you're not mortified by embarrassment because you sent out that text or you made that phone call or you wrote that email. And it's like, dude, I've had so many motherfuckers over the last 10 years send me DMs or emails or text messages in a state of delusional grandiosity, you know, and so I really have an intimate understanding of what that tone feels like. And then my through thread with the mania is almost like a Hunter S. Thompson gonzo journalism of my own mania. So it's like I keep really detailed notes, and it's almost like I'm writing to myself like Hunter S. Thompson. And so then once I crash, I have a real body of work to come back to, and then I can lunch pail it out, you know, like the chop wood, carry water. I find that if the mania doesn't produce tangible or that I can work with once I've crashed, it starts to feel like a depression. But I don't even think of it like a crash, because I can feel it starting to happen. I stoke it and I glide it out as long as I can. And then, like gliding, as soon as I get back close to the ground, I hit the ground running. And for me, the running is the gritty part, where it's like, okay, now you have to write something that fucking makes sense. You have to record a podcast that anyone would fucking care about or be able to track. And because I played video games a lot as a kid, and so I love what it feels like to grind. You know, so after I have a wave of mania, it's grind time. And I love it. You know, and so, like the last couple of times I've had bouts of mania, it's turned into some of my most successful artistic creations. And the last thing is, I also have a really brutal boundary with myself, where it's like, I spent so much time in metaphysics as an early 20-year-old that I have no time for it, where it's like, if this doesn't translate into something that I can do, I just let it go. And I trust that if it's super important, it'll come back to me in some way. But if it doesn't translate, it's just like, get the fuck out, you know?
Yeah. I find like Vipassana meditation's been pretty balancing and regulating for me. But when you're in those states, it can be really hard to meditate.
For sure.
You know, like it's like, so it's like kind of counteractive, because you sit down and for like 5-10 minutes and then you're like, I gotta get up and do this thing. But I mean, that's kind of how my book was born, because I like conceived of the book in this really like manic state, and then I wrote all these like application letters to various publishers, and then had one that agreed,
cool,
you know, to do the book. But it was like, then it was the grind for like, you know, two years afterwards or whatever. But it's like the quality of ideas that can be conceived in those states is sometimes really exceptional. But then it's like having the follow through, where if I didn't have that literal contract, I don't know if I actually would have followed through on it. And for me, like back when I used to take more psychedelics like more regularly, I definitely felt like, yeah, psychedelics were sometimes producing those kind of, especially LSD, I think, like you were saying, tended to produce. Favorite. I want to pare it back a little bit, and let's talk about the Dharma. We were talking about sort of this idea that we have a kind of soul purpose, or that there's this like work that we need to accomplish in the world. And I think it's also similar to the idea of the true will. And so what advice would you have to anybody that's listening to this that is not actively stepping into that, maybe due to fear or due to whatever it is, or just confusion, like they don't know who they are or like what they're meant to do in this world, and like where would they start? Would you have them first examine their fears, like you were saying, and look at those death cookies as being the starting place, or like what's the starting place?
Yeah, this is a great question, and It really depends on where people are at. I think one of the most useful models to download is like a human developmental map, and that humans have stages of development, and specifically our consciousness has measurable stages of development. And like when I first found out about this, like there's some really good fucking science about the developmental stages of human consciousness in ways that can be measured. You know, it's not just people waving their fucking hand and writing a book that sells 1 million copies. These are people who are exposing this to the rigors of science. And the most accredited and tested map that I have found, and I just found it 2.5 years ago because of my mentor Churchill, is called the Stages Matrix of Development. And when I first learned about this, I was like, why the fuck was this not taught in school? Because I have a degree in psychology. And I was like, this was never fucking talked about. So that's a whole rabbit hole. But so there are stages of development, and it depends on what stage of development someone's at for what will work for them the most. But where I tend to start with most people, because this is what I needed to accept when I was in my early 20s, that kind of got me started. And it's like, my conjecture is that it is a verifiable fact that you have a soul, and that your soul is calling you to do specific things, and that if you don't, the result is mental illness. And if you do, the result is a type of meaning that alchemizes almost any mental illness. And I say almost because, again, I want to speak to the fact that our culture has gotten to a place where there are environmental toxins that can fuck up our hardware. But the majority of what we think of as mental illness and even chronic disease is actually, in my opinion, a result of not being in accord with your soul. And so, my technical, experiment for people is, I think it's a scientifically verifiable fact that you have what we call a soul, but really what that means is there is something inside of you that you do not have conscious control over, that is drawn to specific things that you can either look away from or look towards. So for example, you don't get to choose who you fall in love with. That's a duh. You don't get to choose what is interesting to you. And this is a technical, scientific rabbit hole that, I had a friend ask me, do you really think that we don't get to choose what we're interested in? And what I said to him is, my guy, I've spent over 100 hours studying this. What I'll tell you is, if you spend 100 hours trying to answer that question, you will either go insane or you will acquire a humility or a sense of humor for the rest of your life. I think those are the only two options when you really try to study perceptual psychology and try to grok the fact that we don't get to choose what seizes our interest moment to moment. That it's actually a computational impossibility to systematically review all possible options in every moment and then to select the just right, most useful thing to us to pay attention to. For example, there's 100,000 pixels that you could be focusing on in my background right now that you're just not. It's just not even a problem. Hopefully, I'm interesting enough that you're tracking what I'm saying. But you're not thinking about the 100,000 things that you could be thinking about right now, that you have the capacity to think about right now. was 10 and my mom was pregnant, and when she had her daughter, which is my sister, she had to go to work and work basically full time, and I had to basically, with the help of my other siblings, I had to raise a newborn. And when my sister got to about the age of like 18 months, she became obsessed with a movie, Finding Nemo, where she would ask us to replay it for her, and she probably watched it 150 times. Without getting into the details, that movie mythopoetically resonated with things I knew she would find out about her situation when she was older that didn't make any fucking sense to me. Like, what I saw as a teenager was her soul saw something in that story that was made for her life path that would inform her for the next 20 years. And then that's what got the myths that make us kind of rolling, is that I've interviewed over like 150 people, and I ask all of them, what was your favorite story as a kid? And then I ask them to retell that story like they're telling a bedtime story to a smart 10-year-old. And every single fucking interview, and they're all on the internet, you know, the people are basically articulating their personal myth that's like their karma to alchemize. And so to me, that's like a undeniable fact. And what I have found is that as soon as I started respecting my unconscious mind like it were a god, and I started doing the things that it asked me to do that scared me, my life transformed into a more beautiful version of a life than I had the capacity to like chaos magic into existence. Like, it was beyond what I could conceive. And there are so many tendrils here, but I think the first psychological discovery that I found that really crystallized this for me was what is called expressive writing. So there's a psychologist at the University of Austin named James Pennebaker. It's also funny that in his last name is the word pen, and his entire fucking career is to study the impacts of writing. But basically what he found is that if people write stream of consciousness for 4 days in a row on the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to them, that something in the psyche begins to organize the experience in such a way where for the next year they go to the doctor half as often. If they have PTSD, their symptoms are reduced. If they have any type of chronic pain disorder, their symptoms are reduced. If they have sleeping problems, their sleeping improves, and a whole host of other things. And when I first found that in my early 20s, I was like, this is the daemon. Like, this is the soul. This is what happens when we start telling ourselves the truth. You know, because like, whatever is haunting you is this same function. You don't get to choose, but things from your past just keep coming up. And I think that if we turn towards it and start to practice our capacity to tell ourselves the type of truths that make us cry, we start to get into alignment with this whisper. So like, the first thing that I recommend to anybody is like, practice telling yourself the truth every day, like it is the craft of crafts. And if you don't practice telling yourself the truth every day, you're lying to yourself. Because I've studied behavioral economics, the human capacity to delude ourselves is vast. But the wild thing is that, like, it's anyone listening, if you get a piece of paper and a pen and you write down what pop up. And there's just so many of those types of questions that if we're brave and we actually want to know, all of the prima materia to make our personal philosopher's stone is inside of us, and it's all of the shit that we're not admitting to ourselves. And like to your point about artists, I love Jungian psychology because it's so confronting. One of the main teachings of Jungian psychology is that there are 3 primary modern repressions. So the first one is lust. Everyone wants to fucking be fucked. And there's a lot of good boys and good girls out here who are in denial about that. The second one is aggression/power. All of us want to be the dom, the dictator, the tyrant, especially if we've been treated unfairly and we've been quiet about it. The third one is status. Each of us want to be the best, the absolute best, and the ones who don't admit that or who can't even connect to that tend to be the passive-aggressive, resentful, bitter people out here. And like I find personally amongst artists, and it seems to be almost exclusively men, which is interesting, the more they are obsessed with conspiracy, the more I find that they're repressing their ambition. It's almost like to the degree that their ambition is not integrated is the degree to which they're obsessed with conspiracies. You know, because there's this felt sense of like they get to feel like they're smarter than everybody else, but they also use it to justify not fucking trying. You know, because the world's so fucked up.
Yeah, that checks out. Yeah, it's interesting. And, from ceremonial magic, they have this idea of the holy guardian angel as basically the same as the daimon, but it's kind of like an external entity that you can form a relationship to. And it's highly debated as to whether or not it's something that's outside of us or if it's a part of us, or, like our consciousness is so wide that what's the difference? But
exactly,
it's, right. It's both, right? Like it's a paradox, but it has been interesting for me to explore. Like I've had really synchronistic experiences with the holy guardian angel through ceremonial magic that were really powerful and profound. And I do think there's something useful about being able to externalize the daimon as something that you can actually speak to and have an interface with, and it'll provide. Like if you ask it questions, it will answer in ways that surprise you, like things that you wouldn't expect it to say, or to advise you in ways that you probably wouldn't tell yourself, these kinds of things. And it seems to also.
Would you be willing to share one of your stories, like one of your synchronicities with your holy guardian angel?
Sure. Yeah, I don't mind. So, I mean, the first experience I had of the holy guardian angel is something that they might call in ceremonial magic the vision of the angel from Malkuth. So it's like, it's not the full knowledge and conversation experience, but I did a ritual called Liber Semek, which is one of Aleister Crowley's rituals. It's based on another ritual that's quite extensive called the Abramelin ritual, which is like, have you ever seen the movie A Dark Song? Mm-hmm. They're kind of like the base movie off that ritual. But anyway, it's like that's a super involved process. It's like anywhere from 3 to 18 months, and it's like you need to not leave your house for 18 months and have like a freezer full of meat to survive or whatever. And it's I don't really know many people who have ever done it. I thought it would be like really cool someday to try to do it and then like write about what that is, but it's quite intense.
For sure.
So Crowley created this ritual called Liber Semek. Semek is this is something I wanted to talk to you about, because I remember listening to your ayahuasca trip report, and you talked about how you pulled the temperance card or the art card, which is the same, but that's like the Crowley's version. So that's Semek. And Samek is the path that leads directly to the holy guardian angel in the tree of life. So Tifereth, that's the sphere of the sun. That's like where the it's basically the representation of Christ consciousness, or the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, like seeing things through an enlightened state of mind. So I thought it was really interesting that you shared in your podcast that you pulled that art card, because that art card is like the daimon card. That was really synchronistic. So anyway, I did this ritual Liber Samek, and I took mushrooms when I did it, and I laid down and I did it like astrally. So I kind of like memorized the ritual and then watched it like play out in my mind. And I had this vision of this like overwhelmingly beautiful kind of deity that was sort of made of mirrors, but each one was reflecting like a different universe.
For sure.
But it felt like it was me forever, like it wasn't anything separate from me. It was like, in a way, it was more me than me, was kind of the sense that I got about it, that it's like it's the eternal aspect of my consciousness, not the temporal aspect of my consciousness. And so it's like who I was before I was born, in a way, and probably will continue to be, like, even after I die. And so that experience lasted for however long it lasted, and there was like a kind of whole drama that also unfolded where it was so bright and luminous that like all these demons were like attracted to its light, and they were like trying to get at me and like trying to get at the angel, but it was like the radiance of the angel was so bright and powerful that it was like like the demons couldn't touch it. Like it was this just impenetrable force of light. And a really interesting thing happened to me also after that experience, which was that I felt like I was the player playing my character as if I was like a video game character. And I had this greater level of control over myself as like an avatar. Like I could just sit perfectly still in meditation for like an hour without any kind of hesitation or anything. Like it was really weird, like this kind of almost dissociated level of control that I had over my like flesh suit body, like my ego self, afterwards. But that wasn't, I think, really like the full kind of knowledge and conversation experience. It was more of like a vision of what that potential could be. And then more recently, I did another kind of dramatic and intense initiation ritual that's within the canon of ceremonial magic. And afterwards, I went into a state where I like called on my holy guardian angel, which is kind of like a consistent practice, just like even as like a daily thing that people who practice magic often do. But this time I was like given a name. And the name was Ea, and I hadn't heard this name before, so I asked ChatGPT about it. I was like, "What's the significance of the name Ea?" And Ea was a Sumerian god who is the god of art and magic.
Oh man!
And I was like, "What the fuck?" Like, and then also the enumeration of the name, it's the number 6, which is also basically, so like I said, the sphere of Tifereth, that's the 6th sphere of the tree of life, and that also encapsulates the holy guardian angel. So that to me was kind of like verifiable evidence of like, okay, that's the name. And now I have this kind of like it's like once you have a name of something, you can call it, right? Like there's a lot of in magic about just like knowing the names. So I felt like I was given this kind of calling card that now I can call upon it as like a force to direct me or to interface with. And I've done some interesting, actually, like I have this technique. It's like an active imagination technique. But what I do, because I'm fluent in typing, is like I will set up like a Word document. I'll put on like, I don't know, like shamanic or like meditative music. And then I'll put like a sleep mask on. And I'll just like go into like an inner space kind of state, and I'll just have a conversation, like, and I'll describe everything that's happening, and I'll use the kind of typing as a way of like maintaining a level of lucidity, like while I'm exploring the inner state. So I've had these like dialogues with it. And it's not really like coming to mind right now, like any specific advice or whatever that it's given me. But I do remember having these kinds of dialogues with it, whether it, and it's like, I'm also skeptical. It's like whether it actually is like this thing, or it is just some kind of thing that my consciousness produces. But still, like, some of the experiences I've had with it have been just like really synchronistic and weird. But yeah, it's definitely given me information or advice that I don't think I would have thought of. Like, before I started typing, I started imagining in my mind, like, oh, if I ask this question, it's going to say this. But then when I actually go into the experience, it's like, oh, I know what it's going to say. But it doesn't. It says something different. And another thing, just in terms of like verifying angels, I've also done like evocation work. So evocation is when you actually summon like an angel or something like that, and you use a magical triangle, just like this, cool piece of like occult technology with like a black mirror. And I've done it, usually do it with another person who's like the scryer. So I have some friends that are really intuitive and open, and I've like been like, hey, do you want to do this ritual thing with me? And I did a couple rituals with the same angels, but with like different people scrying. And in both cases, the angels had like the same personalities and similar appearances even, and would sort of answer things in the same way. So they had like a character to them that was kind of objective and defined, that you could speak to them with, and it's just stuff like this is really weird, right? Because like when you start exploring magic and you get into this stuff, like you're gonna have some weird experiences like this. But it definitely, I know it throws into question a lot of things, about the objectivity of these kinds of entities and that we can tune into.
Yeah, so like for me, I had to get so I think the first thing about everything that you shared is, I think one of the most healing things to our soul is the subjective gnosis of communion with some other intelligence. Like, as an atheist, that was one of the things that kind of like healed me the most, was this undeniable subjective gnosis that there's other intelligence that is paying attention to me, not knowing anything else, but just the subjective. Like, in the same way I know if someone's hugging me, it was like there are other things that care. My path into this was dream work. My ego and my skeptic, up until just a couple of years ago, was sufficiently rigid where I couldn't access magic, at least not consciously. But through dream work and the synchronicities that came as a result of dream work, and I had a period in college where I lucid dreamed almost every day, and it's a whole really interesting story. But what came from that was this felt sense that there is a intelligence in me that is paying attention, that is smarter than me, that is a sufficiently incredible artist that it creates worlds for me at night that are so real that I can't tell that I'm dreaming most of the time. And that these worlds are teaching tools to reveal things to me that I'm blind to currently. Like, one of the hallmarks of Jungian dream analysis is that your dreams are not congratulating you. Your dreams are trying to reveal blind spots, almost always. And your dreams aren't trying to trick you. They just speak the language that they know, which is simple. intuition for how to translate the symbols of my dreams that were consistently producing surprising insights that revealed blind spots in me. It made me religious in a way that I can't explain. Like, even though I didn't have a name for it. Like, have you seen the video of Carl Jung being asked if he believes in God?
Yeah.
It's one of the most gangster things that exists on the internet. He gets asked, and you get to see his face, and you can, like, it gives me so much life every time I see it, because he gets this, like, amused smile, and he's like, believe? No. I know. And he's saying it with this smirk that just conveys, like, this is what happens when you learn how to open yourself up to the unconscious. And to your point earlier where you were like, you know, it's debated, is it outside of us or inside of us, or is consciousness so wide that there isn't a difference? This is my current pain in my life with all of my friends, which is, like, one of the core things Jung was trying to teach is that if you have a dream of going to the moon and talking to your ancestors, that's real. And what's funny is it's like every spiritual person I know, they can't grok this. And whenever I try to give them kind of the Jungian interpretation of aliens or entities or whatever else, I can tell that they feel like I'm negating the profundity of their experiences. But I'm like, no, I'm trying to share with you that your boundary of what the psyche is egregiously too small, and that it doesn't reduce the intensity or the profundity of these experiences. What it does is it should hopefully spook your ego to really recognize that, like, all these motherfuckers that quote Jung, it's like, did you read anything that he wrote? You know, it's like all of the gods and the demons and the angels and the heroes and the devils and the monsters, they're in us. What the psyche is like, one of the things I try to convey to people is it's like anything that you can contemplate is arising within your psyche. Any entity that has ever attacked you has arisen in your psyche. Any dialogue or channel or insight or vision that anything you can grok ever arose inside of your psyche. And that, for me, I've just always had the assumption, you know, and I adopted it from Jung, and it's had a 100% success rate so far, is that anything that arises in my psyche, if I treat it like it's archetypical content, it is alchemizable. You know, so I've never been attacked by an entity, you know, and I have friends who, in order for them to fucking go to a festival, they have to do all sorts of fucking rituals and shit to, like, protect themselves and clean themselves, and it's like, yo, I don't do any of that, you know. And I think even you would agree that I seem to be less attacked by entities than you know. And so it's like, I don't even waste time on thinking about if it's outside or inside. It's, you know, if I take this whisper from this dream and I enact it in my life, is it more beautiful and more interesting and more dynamic and more magical? You know, and if it is, I'm going to keep doing it.
Have you seen that Pixar movie Soul?
Yeah.
You know how they have, like, when they go into the soul school, and then there's I forget what the character's name is, like Jeff or something like that. That's the sort of teacher figure. And he's like, actually, I'm the intersection of like 9 dimensions that would be beyond your comprehension in human form, but you can call me Jeff. It's like, that's what I think of like entities being like we can grok Thoth as like a ibis headed god. Like that's something that we can imagine. We can have an experience of that. But like what it actually is a vast, incomprehensible form. That's not something that we can even wrap our minds around. It's just too big for our little puny human brains to be able to reconcile, you know? And so I think no matter what it is, like a dream symbol or an experience of like an entity or whatever, it's always just what our psyche uses to translate what is otherwise this vast abstract force in the universe for us to be able to perceive it.
That applies to us and each other. Like, and this is why Jungian projection is such a fascinating thing to really contemplate. But like the thing I tell people is, you've lived with you your entire life. And hopefully you're at the point of wisdom where you understand that you don't know what the fuck you are. So when you fall in love with someone and you feel like you know them, that should be a motherfucking red light dinging. Where it's like, I am in the presence of my projection. Mm-hmm. You know, because another human is as mysterious as you are. And you haven't had the intimacy of being inside of their experience, you know, for 3 decades. And so it's like, I love that example of Jeff. It's so funny. And it also applies to each of us. Like every time we look onto another human, like one of the things that I'm really grateful for is, you know, default mode consciousness. Because if we didn't have it, every time we looked at another person, we would just fall to our knees in awe. Because it would be so much. And so like, whenever we look at someone and we think we know who they are, you know, and the fact that we feel comfortable or fucking bored, you know, like if we're talking to someone and we're not curious or interested in what they have to say, it's like, you're missing what's happening right now.
Yeah, I was listening to a relationship podcast by this guy, Stan Tankin. I got into his work recently. He's really great on relationships, but he was saying that like we aim for efficiency. Like there's something about like human beings are energy efficient.
Yeah.
And so when we've been in relationship with somebody for like a while, we kind of like automate them. So that's why when you first meet somebody, like you have a new lover or something, it's everything so like fresh and new. But then you get to a certain point where people kind of start taking each other for granted. It's because we just kind of automate them at some version of themselves that they're not even at. But we like logged them as this past version of themselves, and that's just who they are, you know, which is unfortunate. But I think it takes like a real active effort to overcome that tendency, which is so ingrained in us.
Yeah, it's like, there's so much interesting stuff to talk about when it comes to relationships, but I think one of them is, if you're afraid of commitment to one person for the rest of your life, you just don't know what it means to be with one person. Because they're not one person. They're hundreds. And the thing about a commitment to one person is you're basically committing to meeting their pantheon instead of projection, and really, like a person who is serially monogamous, they're actually dating one person over and over and over and over again. But if you commit and you stay beyond that, 8-month to 14-month projection zone where it's like everything, they're the one, I've known them for past lives, blah, blah, blah. Once you pop that bubble, you then get the opportunity to start to have a relationship with a pantheon of people inside of that one person. And yeah, it's there's also one thing about spiritual advice when it comes to relationships that no one talks about is, I wish anyone in the spiritual space who talked about relationships would be required to study evolutionary biology. Because it's that shit matters. One of the things from evolutionary biology that almost no one talks about is that women's genes are such where they're only attracted to what they perceive as equal value males or higher. Whereas men, their genes tend to only be attracted to equal value or lower status women.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the higher the IQ and income of a woman, the less likely she is to be married. And that's a really savage thing to know. But it's also if you're gonna give some fucking relationship advice, you ought to know some evolutionary biology. And so it's not just heal the polarity within yourself and you'll attract the just right person, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that will help. But also, it's if you're 38 and you're trying to attract someone that you want to have a family with, there are some non-spiritual things that you have to attend to if you want to be attractive, period,
Yeah. I got really into David Data's work a few years ago, and he basically claims that spiritually involved people are the least developed or the least advanced in relationships, which is why he kind of focused on that as kind of a crucible for spiritual development, because it's what brings up all of our shit. Sure. And it's I know I live in a spiritual community basically, and I know so many people who have just avoided relationships for years and years and years because it's just too difficult and too disruptive and too challenging.
Yeah, the era of polyamory as a escaping away from dealing with your bullshit. At least that's what I see.
Yeah, I mean, I've explored polyamory pretty thoroughly, and it brings its own bullshit too. But I've also had some really healthy polyamorous relationships. I think people that tend to get really into polyamory are relationship nerds, so they often come with more sort of training or than the average person.
Yeah, I find that at least in Austin, that's not really the case. So I think if the spiritual community is close-knit enough and people have had multiple game iterations with each other, it tends to sift out the spiritual fuckboys and the spiritual fuckgirls. But in a place like Austin, because especially in the last few years, there's been so many new people with wealth coming into the city, it's pretty savage out here, and it's not super, there are for sure pockets of consciousness, but there's a lot of 23-year-old women who are trying to be spiritual that are interacting with specific types of men that are not yielding deeper consciousness.
Yeah, feeler healers. I mean, it's like that everywhere. It's definitely like that here. It's interesting. I've been kind of I've explored a little bit of like the BDSM scene in places like Berlin or like whatever. And actually those types of scenes tend to really bring people with like a high amount of awareness and intelligence when it comes to things like
100%.
boundaries and respect, and it's all on the table and everything's very transparent about like what people intend to do and what people are signing up for and consenting to. But within spiritual communities like tantric communities, there seems to be like way more incidents of violation of people's boundaries and predatory
really
behavior and stuff. And I think it's kind of I think it's like bringing in this kind of almost Christian like the repression of sexuality, that it's only valid if it's something spiritual, but it's still kind of like not really open. Whereas, in like a BDSM community, they're like, yeah, we just want to fuck. Like I own that. Like I'm not ashamed of that. And so we can just talk about it. Like it's not a big deal,
Yeah. And what I find is, I find that the structure of BDSM, when it's actually done properly, is like the most honest and healthy like container to hold the intensity of sexual energy. And whereas in any spaces that don't have that level of intense articulated boundary, it can just be so sloppy. And I think that if we were a more mature culture, that BDSM would actually be a potent psychotherapy, but that is definitely, it's happening, but it has to be underground because it's so volatile. And it is worth mentioning that BDSM space also has predators that,
yeah, for sure.
I know a couple of incidences personally where it's just like, damn, a very competent player, has gotten into that game and they're able to hurt a lot of people. But on average, I find that the BDSM community is one of the most like conscious and healthiest spaces if you are lucky enough or discerning enough to find the right partners.
Yeah, it's kind of it's interesting too because it's boundaried, so it's one of those things within, like if you're doing a magic ritual, like you cast a circle, like you close the circle and you do the ritual and then that's it. It doesn't bleed out, and I think that with like BDSM as a practice, it's kind of like a similar thing where you're exploring these different power dynamics and energies within that as like a boundaried space so that it doesn't necessarily like bleed out into the rest of your life. Because I think if those kinds of urges are repressed or subverted, so they're more subconscious, then it can kind of act out in people's lives and relationship dynamics in a way that is unintentional, rather than building a container to actively express it in an intentional way to let it to have a healthy expression.
Yeah, and at the same time, I also think I have personally found, because I've explored that realm, and it's still something that weaves in and out of my life, but I also play with almost the complete opposite, which is no masturbation, no porn, and only like sex when it's like tender and super, because then what happens is there's this fucking overflow that must go into my art. And like really fucking like it's definitely hard because like we live in a time now where most men on the planet are addicted to porn because it's so easy to access and it's so visually stimulating. But man, over the last like year and a half, I've started to like not no fap, because I'm in a relationship, but like no porn masturbating, no even looking. And at first it was like, I'm gonna fucking explode, you know, because the male mind is savage, especially if you have high testosterone. It's just fucking, it's like women don't get it. But it's almost like after I got through like 10 days where it's like I can't think about anything else but just fucking everyone I see, something like flipped and my writing just fucking, you know. And so I think it's interesting, you know, like Aleister Crowley talks about like the magician goes into every single place where they're uncomfortable and they stay there until they're comfortable. You know, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that it's a really interesting experiment to do that's on like the opposite pole.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I kind of subscribe to similar practices. Like, I stopped watching porn like a few years ago, and I think it just exponentially it can really increase the quality of somebody's life to just, you know, just eliminate that as like mind garbage. But it's a principle from like Think and Grow Rich. I remember sexual transmutation or something like that.
Cool.
Like when the energy is not being directed out like sexually, like it has to go somewhere, but that same sexual force that's our creativity, right? It's like to create a work of art is to give birth to something. It's the same as making a baby, kind of, you know, so we can channel that into things that we create.
Yeah, and it makes me jealous of women who can just have multiple orgasms, you know. It's like, what must that be like as an artist, you know, where it's just like,
yeah,
just more and more and more. Like I've experimented with like the multi-orgasmic man techniques and shit, and like I've been able to do it a couple of times, but it's so frustratingly hard that I just, yeah, so I'm kind of envious of women's creative capacity, if you will.
Yeah. I don't know how we got on this tangent. I like it. It wasn't in the plan, but yeah, it's cool. Cool, man. Well, it's pretty late here. It's like 2:30 in the morning. It might be a good time to like wrap up, but anything else you want to share before we go?
I'm really inspired to learn from you, actually, as like a chaos magician teacher. So, yeah, I would just love to get some recommendations from you about where you would suggest I start, and just anything that comes to mind.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you're already familiar with Robert Anton Wilson. I think books like Prometheus Rising are good places to start if you're just kind of new to it. Have you seen Grant Morrison's lecture from DeSinfoCon? Do you know who Grant Morrison is?
Oh,
so
yeah.
That's a kind of like fun primer. And oh yeah, cool, sweet. Yeah, so like the Invisibles is a good place to learn about chaos magic for sure. But Peter J. Carroll is kind of the authority on chaos magic, and I'd really recommend checking out his books. You know, chaos magic is really like a fuck around and find out kind of ethos. Yeah. And so, you know, any chaos magician who says that they have found like the chaos magic, they're lying, because really it's an individual practice. I love the Temple of Psychic Youth is really cool. So Genesis P-Orridge, who is the founding member of Throbbing Gristle, like they basically invented industrial music. So no Throbbing Gristle, no Nine Inch Nails, like all this stuff that came after them. So cultural figure, musician, who created a chaos magic order that was experimenting with using art to change the world.
Cool.
The idea was using art as a vehicle of magic. So they would create sigilized artworks. They would, you know, use music. They would use film, television, radio, like all these different things to kind of try to blast it out into the world. And I really the temple of psychic youth. Yeah. And I really wish I could have had a chance to have been a part of it. It disbanded, I think, in the 90s. I once had a dream where Janice Pioridge came to me and told me that I was like an honorary member of of Topi. So I was like, okay, cool. Like, I'm a part of it. But yeah, the idea that art is a magical act. You know, like if you think about the old cave paintings in Lascaux, like I think of those as sigils. You know, that they probably thought that by investing energy into creating these works of art, it would increase their potential to have a successful hunt.
100%.
You know, and so it's like there's this idea of a hyper sigil. Do you know what a hyper sigil is?
Yeah, but I can't. Yeah, but please.
Okay. So like a hyper sigil is when you create like a narrative art form.
That's right.
So it could be like Grant Morrison made comic books, but it could also be like a concept album, or it could be a song, or it could be like an Instagram account. It could be anything that you design it to be, but it's a long form narrative, magical working where you basically tell true lies. You lie, but it's like stuff that you want to have happen. So you can write it as a story.
Yeah.
And then like the charging of the sigil is people that consume the art. You know, so Grant Morrison in The Invisibles, he created a character that's based off himself. And then he noticed it was working because he put his character through some like rough shit. Like he had some kind of lung infection or something, and then he ended up in the hospital. And he was like, oh man, I'm going to make him only go through some like pleasant shit after this. But yeah, that to me is just so fascinating. The idea that we can bend reality with intention and through creativity and, you know, imbue magic into our art and have the intention of it transforming ourselves, transforming our lives, transforming the world, you know?
I'm in, and I'm gonna start to look into this because this feels like this is a part of what my initiation with my voice wants me to do. Basically, I'm going to try a bunch of ways of healing it, and I'm going to be like a gonzo journalist and just write the stories of my earnest attempts, you know. And it's like I just have faith that something's gonna. And so one of the things I'm going to formally investigate and try on myself is magic.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of success with working with archangels, and there's sort of traditional practices that are more ceremonial magic than chaos magic related to that. But there are archangels that specifically facilitate healing. There may be ones that I can't recall off the top of my head that might specifically facilitate things like speech or expression or something that might also help, you know. But that rabbit hole is deep. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, it's like it's quite a deep dive. Might as well summon some demons too.
Why not?
just to see what happens.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate your time, and there will be more conversations. I know it.
Yeah, definitely, man. I'm so glad we were finally able to do this.
Same. Easy 2.5
Cool.
hours, yeah. So, sleep well, man. I'll talk
Thanks.
to you soon.
Yeah. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the podcast. I am the DFT Elf. Escape into your dimension. New episodes of the Creativity and Consciousness podcast drop each week. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to stay connected and join a like-minded community, hop in the Telegram group where we discuss the latest episodes and ideas they spark. Sending you instant love and gratitude for being part of this journey.